All right, welcome back to the channel. It's your boy Fanon, and in this video, we're going to talk about Floyd Mayweather Jr. putting Errol, Spence, and these other PBC fighters in a place. Crazy. Actually, is that what he did? It sounded like it to me. Let's talk about that in this video. All right, welcome back to the channel. It's your boy Fanon. In this video, we're going to talk about what Floyd Mayweather Jr. had to say about Errol Spence Jr. and Terrence Crawford in a recent interview, and how it sheds a good amount of light on exactly how much influence he has in the PBC and whether or not he is maybe one of the guys that are causing a hurdle in this fight between Errol Spence Jr. and Terrence Crawford. Before I get into that, though, let me welcome you back to the channel. If you are new to the channel, please accept my invitation to subscribe to the channel. Hit the bell icon so you can be notified of when we release more videos. And also, if you are a longtime subscriber and supporter to the channel, please make sure to continue to watch the channel, hit that like button, and thank you so much for all your support and your continued support on the channel. All right, man, so this is just real interesting stuff to me, man, because I listened to Floyd Mayweather Jr. In a press conference, and Floyd Mayweather Jr. talked about pretty much his role with the PBC and what he knows about what's going on behind the PBC going on behind the scenes in the PBC, and how other fighters that are directly or should be directly involved with those fights, because they're their own promoters, do not know as much as the behind the scene details as he does. And it strikes me real funny. And it strikes me real funny because of the way that the PBC is organized, right? So take, for example, you have Errol Spence Jr., you also have Gervonta Tank Davis, you have Keith Thurman, you have Deontay Wilder. All of these guys have their own promotional companies, and they are signed to the PBC. And so when Floyd Mayweather Jr. said that Errol Spence Jr. did not, when he retweeted what Mike Coppinger said, that Errol Spence Jr. does not have the behind the scenes information that Floyd Mayweather Jr. had, for me, that raises a red flag. Because if you have a scenario the way that the PBC is said to operate, you have, and just take Errol Spence out of it for a second, and just say Keith Thurman, right? Say Keith Thurman is trying to make a fight with Jaron Ennis. If Keith Thurman's manager is Al Heyman, and Al Heyman's job is to negotiate the fight for Keith Thurman with Jaron Ennis, how would it be that Floyd Mayweather Jr. would be more privy to information about the details of the negotiation than Keith Thurman would be if Keith Thurman is talking to his manager, Al Heyman? That, to me, is a big red flag, because if this was a scenario, for example, where like say Top Rank, for example, and you have Top Rank as a promoter, and Top Rank represents Keith Thurman, and it's an in-house fight, but that's the promoter, right? Then it would make sense that people that work for the promoter would know could know more about what's going on in the negotiation for the fighter, because that manager would have to go to the promoter. And so there could be things taking place in the promotional office in the negotiations with the manager, right? But in this particular instance, Errol Spence Jr. is his own promoter, and Errol Spence Jr. is the manager. So, I mean, and Terrence and Al Heyman is the manager or advisor. So it should be that the conversation should be taking place between Al Heyman and Errol Spence on a daily basis, if that is actually operating the way that from the outside it looks like it's operating. What it looks like to me, though, is that if what Floyd Mayweather Jr. is saying is correct, Floyd Mayweather Jr. is actually talking to Al Heyman more consistently and before Al Heyman actually talks to the person that he's managing in Errol Spence Jr., and that seems to be a little bit of a conflict of interest to me. Now, that's just me on the outside looking in. But when Errol had retweeted what Mike Coppinger said about the fight between he and Terrence almost being done and there being a date that they were looking for, like October 29th. It seems to me where Floyd is saying is, look, like Errol doesn't know the details like I know the details. I'm really behind the scenes, which means I'm talking to Al Heyman and the people that are really responsible for organizing the fight. Now, I don't know, maybe he could also be meaning, Steven Espinoza, but it's just, that to me seems to be like a very, very, it's just an odd situation where you could have a fighter who is in the negotiation, whose manager and advisor both run the PBC, where they would be giving more information to somebody other than the fighter themselves. Right now, it may also mean, right, that that this was he could be talking about just that particular detail, right, of the date of the fight, right? Where is it going to be October 29th or is it not going to be October 29th, right? So maybe Floyd knew more about that specific detail than other people knew. I can't tell you, but it just seems to me like that's just a real kind of funny flow of information from what I can see. I would think that Errol would be knowing about that right away. Now, maybe what Floyd is meaning is that Errol was just kind of hyping up the fight and just kind of co-signed it just to get, the fire going in the fight, and that he knew all those details. Could be, but man, that was, to me, like the first time I heard it, I was like, man, is this guy is he working with Terrence Crawford? But in this particular incident, he said, no, me working with Terrence Crawford doesn't have anything to do with it. I'm just more behind the scenes with all these PBC fights than the fighters are. Now, that also does let you know something for sure, that Floyd Mayweather Jr. is an owner in the PBC, and anything connected with PBC has to include Floyd as well. That has not always been out there in the public, but it's something that I just think is without a doubt, a very, very obvious thing. But anyway, man, it was very, very interesting to hear that. I'm hoping that that this fight does get made. Now Floyd said, you'll hear about this when I tell you about it. You're not going to hear about it from anybody else. We'll see if that's true. But honestly, man, I hadn't heard I've never heard Floyd Mayweather Jr. announce an Errol Spence Jr. fight before. So that whole thing to me, is just more than a little bit perplexing. But, it is what it is. We'll see. Could be a little bit of Floyd, or I would say, you usually say it's Floyd's ego, but no, man, that to me sounds like, no, he's taking more of a hands-on role with setting the fights with the PBC and working with Showtime and, trying to figure out what those guys are going to do. Now, also, he may very well just be a party to the negotiation with being in PBC and talking about what he, as a representative of PBC, is not going to be willing to do. And that could be not willing to make a fight at a specific day, or not willing to make a fight at all. It could mean that Floyd Mayweather Jr. basically has veto power on fights. Real interesting stuff though, man, when you break it down and you listen to what he said. But anyway, you let me know what you think in the comment section. And with that, I'm out. Peace.